Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash. Welcome to Well Said. When we think about what puts our hearts at risk, we usually think of things like high blood pressure, smoking, cholesterol, and diabetes. But what if there were hidden dangers, less obvious but perhaps just as harmful, lurking in our environment? Increasingly, scientists are uncovering connections between lead exposure and heart disease. Today, we're digging into how risk factors are identified in general and where lead fits into the picture. To help us make sense of this evolving science, I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Kosnett. Dr. Kosnett is an associate clinical professor in the Division of Pulmonary Sciences and Critical Care Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He's also a consultant in medical toxicology and occupational and environmental medicine in Denver. Michael, welcome to Well Said.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly do we mean when we talk about something being a risk factor for a disease?
A risk factor is an attribute or an exposure or a habit or a practice that a person engages in or possesses that increases the likelihood that they'll get a disease or have a negative outcome from a particular health outcome.
Just to be clear, it doesn't mean that they're definitely going to get it. It just kind of increases the chance that they might get it. Is that right?
Exactly.
Why is it important to identify and understand these so-called risk factors as we go about our everyday lives?
Well, I think for me and most people in public health, it's prevention. And we talk about prevention in many ways as primary prevention or secondary prevention.
Okay.
Now, primary prevention means avoiding the risk factors, such as unhealthy habits or exposures or diets that are deleterious, that could contribute to the development of the disease in the first place. Mm-hmm. So in other words, primary prevention is aimed at people who don't have the disease at the current time. What can they do to avoid the likelihood that they're going to get it?
Okay.
Secondary prevention is something we think of as when you have the disease, most likely at an early stage of the disease, what can you do at these early stages to avoid or modify conditions that would result in the progression of the disease. For example, some of the risk factors for heart disease are the well-known things that you mentioned earlier, like increased cholesterol and smoking and having a lot of stress. Now, if you have primary prevention would mean, for example, avoiding diets that might contribute to you getting high cholesterol. Mm-hmm. The clearest thing with primary prevention of smoking is never taking it up in the first place.
Right.
Secondary prevention means if people already have a condition like high blood pressure, what can they do to treat it and get it under control so it never results in them getting things like a heart attack? If they have diabetes, what can they do to modify their diet or exercise?
Michael, let me just clarify that a little bit, because I generally think of secondary prevention as they already have the heart disease, and therefore we're treating the blood pressure more aggressively or we're treating the diabetes more aggressively. I'm not sure that's exactly what you just said.
It can also mean modifying your risk factors that led to your getting a disease in the first place.
So, Michael, why is it important to identify and understand these risk factors when it comes to assuring good health?
Well, a key thing is prevention. In public health, we often talk about primary prevention and secondary prevention. Primary prevention is avoiding risk factors, such as unhealthy habits or exposures or dietary factors that contribute to the development of a disease in the first place. Mm-hmm. It's an intervention or a lifestyle change before the disease develops.
Okay.
Secondary prevention is once someone has the disease, it's steps that can be taken to follow them or treat them more closely, to have them engage in behaviors, or to basically have more interventions designed to prevent the disease from getting worse.
Okay.
Or for controlling the likelihood that it will result in a negative outcome.
Okay. So in the context that we were just talking about a moment ago, say we want everybody to have a normal blood pressure, that's primary prevention. But in people who have established heart disease, we get even more obsessive about controlling their blood pressure because we know that it's important to help arrest the progression of the disease that they already have, and tight control of their blood pressure is a good way to do that. Is that pretty much what you're saying? I mentioned a couple of risk factors for coronary heart disease, but I think it's a good opportunity opportunity for us to review that for our listeners. So what are the major well-established risk factors for cardiovascular disease?
As you mentioned, high blood pressure or hypertension is a well-recognized risk factor. Increased cholesterol, particularly LDL cholesterol, is a risk factor. Smoking clearly increases the risk of developing heart disease. Sometimes other diseases will increase the risk that someone develops heart disease. For example, diabetes. It can affect the arteries and the blood vessels in a way that decreases the efficiency of blood flow and can contribute to heart disease. And then there are certain risk factors which you really can't modify but are also recognized. And that is, for example, like a family history.
Right.
A history of people in your family, particularly your parents, who have had heart disease at an early age. That increases the risk that you might develop it.
Right. So it's something important to know about, but not obviously anything you can do anything about.
Exactly.
So how do scientists actually establish what risk factors exist? In other words, how do they identify a risk factor, generically speaking?
It's a multi-step process to do it. One of the key ways is through a part of public health or practice of medicine that we call epidemiology. And that's the study of populations of individuals. When we do these kind of studies, we often will look at groups of people who have the risk factor under study and compare them to individuals who don't have the risk factor under study and simply see if those who have the risk factor have an increased prevalence or an increased incidence of developing the disease in question.
So in other words, you look at two groups of people, one has high blood pressure, the other group of people is similar in most respects, but they do have high blood pressure, and then you observe over time that the people who have high blood pressure are more likely to develop heart disease than the folks who don't have high blood pressure.
Exactly.
How is that work actually done? It sounds like it's not that easy to find these populations and follow them for long periods of time.
Well, there are different types of studies. One of the studies that does involve usually large groups of people and takes a longer period of time are called prospective cohort studies. And essentially a cohort is a group or a defined population. So you might look at people who don't have the disease now, but you follow their habits over time, like people who pick up smoking or people who eat high diets in saturated fat, and you compare them over time to people who don't smoke or don't have these dietary risk factors, and you see over time what is the incidence at which heart disease emerges in the group with these habits or practices, and you compare it to those who don't.
The incidence being the number of new cases that develop over time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another type of study is one that we call a case control study. And that's where you take people who already have the disease and you compare them to people who don't have the disease, but who are otherwise generally of the same age and sex, and some other factors might be similar. And then you look into their history and you do studies on them, or you ask them questions, or you go retrospectively about what types of things they've done in the past, and you see whether or not those who already have heart disease will tell you by the history or by the other studies you do on them that they have more of a certain risk factor or attribute than those who don't have it. Mm-hmm. The cases are the ones with the disease, the controls are the ones without the disease, and that's called a case control study. And that's another very powerful epidemiological tool that we use.
And when scientists do these kinds of studies, how strong a signal in general do they need to identify before they say, aha, we found a new connection between, say, an exposure or a behavior and a disease outcome? Is there some sort of standard strength of connection that needs to be identified before it's generally accepted that that's a new risk factor for the disease in question?
Yes, you don't want to rely just on the epidemiological studies alone to make the conclusion that a certain attribute or exposure is a cause of this certain disease. Because the epidemiology studies will show you often an association or a correlation between a certain exposure or habit and the disease, say heart disease. But there might be other factors, what sometimes we call confounders, that exist that we have to make sure are not actually responsible. Let me give you an example. Supposing in our studies we found that people who worked with lead had an increased risk of developing heart disease. Well, maybe it's the case that the lead workers are also more likely to smoke or more likely to engage in unhealthy diet. And it's not the lead that's responsible. It's just that the people who happen to have the lead exposure happen to be more likely to have these other risk factors.
Okay.
So when we design these epidemiological studies, we have to control or adjust for the extent of smoking or the unhealthy diets and make sure that statistically we've adjusted for these other factors. Another thing that comes up when we talk about environmental exposure to lead, sometimes we have seen people who are more likely to be exposed to lead from, say, deteriorating lead paint in housing also happen to be people who live in lower income families. And it's because they have low income, they have less access to health care, and therefore are less able to go and get primary or secondary prevention for other things that cause heart disease. When we design our studies and when we look at environmental exposures in particularly, we have to adjust for things like socioeconomic status or access to health care and other factors. And in the studies that we can talk about that have linked elevated lead exposure to heart disease, they've made those adjustments.
So let's talk about the lead story. You know, when I went to medical school and actually much more recently, lead never made it to that list of established risk factors for heart disease like hypertension and elevated cholesterol and such that we talked about before. So tell us how this lead story emerged. Where did that observation come from, and tell us how you sort of chased that down?
Well, it's interesting. It's really been in the past 20 years that people have had the ability to study people who have had elevated lead exposures, not very high lead exposures, like levels that you might get by somebody engaging in very, very heavy lead exposure, like torch cutting lead paint or melting lead and working in a foundry. They studied people in the general U.S. population who grew up or lived a considerable portion of their lives in the 1960s and the 1970s when there was a lot of lead in the environment due to leaded gasoline. You know, unleaded gasoline was not introduced until the late 1970s, and it really wasn't phased out until the early 1990s. People such as myself who grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s and 1970s had exposures to lead that were more than 10 times higher than what we have today since we've gotten lead out of gasoline. Another big source of lead that occurred in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was the fact that there were more homes that people lived in that contained lead-based paint. And another source of exposure was actually things like the use of lead solder. And the lead solder was used to solder canned food. And in fact, many of the typical types of soup that people bought or sauces or vegetables that were available to families in the 1960s and the 1970s, the solder that was used to seal the can actually contained lead.
So we had a lot of exposure to lead, but how did that lead to the observation that it was connected to heart disease?
After the turn of the last century, in the early 2000s and in the 2010s, people studied the different things that might be associated with heart disease. And they started introducing the measurement of blood lead in certain studies that the government sponsored that involved tens of thousands of people. And one of these studies is known as the National Health and Nutrition Evaluation Survey. And this was a scientific sampling of the general U.S. population, not just people who worked in blue-collar jobs or in industry, but people who work in clerical jobs, just regular consumers in the general population, they realized that individuals in that group who had higher lead exposure as measured in their blood were more likely to have died of heart disease than people who had lower levels of lead exposure.
And Michael, let me just stop you there for a second. Was that a hypothesis at the time, or was that just they measured a whole bunch of stuff and that popped out in the data?
It was a hypothesis, Ira, because we had known even before this that lead was a risk factor for causing high blood pressure.
I see. Okay.
And that was known as far back as the 1970s and 1980s. And since high blood pressure is a known risk factor for heart disease, they thought, well, maybe then people who had lead exposure would also have an increased risk of having heart disease or dying of heart disease.
Yeah, but it sounds like they found that it wasn't necessarily operating through the mediation of high blood pressure. It was kind of a direct effect. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, there may still be a contribution. Some of the ways in which lead may increase a higher risk of dying of heart disease may be because it causes hypertension. But even in those studies, when they controlled for hypertension or they adjusted for it in the statistical analysis, they still found a link between lead and dying of heart disease.
So let me ask you a question about that, because you painted a picture of widespread exposure to lead. Leaded gasoline leading to lead in the atmosphere, lead paint, lead in the soup cans, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all kind of part of a mass exposure to lead. How do you pick the signal out of all of that exposure? How do you know that it's the lead that's the culprit?
Well, a couple of ways. One is you look for something called a dose response. So, in other words, the people who had higher blood lead, and actually there was a research technique, but it was used very effectively, to measure non-invasively the amount of lead that accumulated in people's bones.
Okay.
Lead is handled in the body much like calcium, and most of the calcium in our body is in our bones. So they use this technique called X-ray fluorescence to measure the amount of lead that had accumulated in the bones. So they could see that there was a dose response.
Meaning people who had more lead were more likely to have heart disease.
Right.
Okay.
And dose response is an important factor in establishing causation. But not only that, you sometimes have to look at, is there a rational or plausible mechanism by which lead could cause heart disease? I mean, why would this heavy metal cause heart disease? Well, they've done studies in animals, and they've shown lead increases markers of what we call oxidative stress, which can cause damage to arterioles and small blood vessels and lead to ischemic heart disease. They've also done studies that showed that lead, by its action on the central nervous system, can affect the way the heart rhythm is controlled. There's a risk factor called heart rate variability. And ironically, the less variable your heart rate is, the more likely you are to develop an event that could lead to your death. They also were able to do studies that measured markers of oxidative stress in people as well, and measured the likelihood that an individual's blood is likely to clot or platelet or likely to aggravate. And lead can increase that type of propensity. Studies that were done in animals and experimental settings, in some cases human studies, combined with the epidemiology, increased our confidence that lead was causing heart disease.
So that leads to an interesting question, at least interesting to me, which is you made the case that a lot of us of a certain age were exposed to lead earlier in our lives. There's a lot of heart disease out there. Do you have a sense of how much heart disease in the population that was alive in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is a consequence of their earlier lead exposure?
Well, some people have made those estimates and believe that it could be substantial. The risk associated with exposure to lead in the range that was typical in the general population. So we often measure lead in terms of the amount of lead in blood.
Okay.
And we use a unit called micrograms per deciliter. So the general population in the United States typically had blood leads between 10 to 25 micrograms per deciliter back in the 1960s and the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Now today, the average person has a blood lead less than 1. So as we've gotten lead out of gasoline and gotten lead out of paint, or at least new paint, and we no longer use lead in solder in places where it can come in contact with food or water, lead levels have fallen by 95% in the general population. The risks associated with the people who had more lead exposure in that range of 10 to 25 versus the lower end of that range were about 2 to 5-fold increased. And a 2 to 5-fold increase in the risk of dying of heart disease from lead is on a par with the risk associated with having high blood pressure, having high cholesterol, or smoking. And we all recognize those as substantial risk factors. And lead is on the same par in terms of magnitude of risk as those other risk factors.
I mean, I guess there's a good story and a bad story there. So it had a substantial effect, but you also said that the exposure for most people today is substantially lower than it was back in the day. So who's most at risk for exposure to lead today?
Lead levels have gone down, as we mentioned, in the general population, but there's still a substantial amount of lead exposure in certain jobs that work with lead or involve exposure to lead. For example, making lead batteries, storage batteries like the ones that are used in automobiles, or backup power supplies that are used for computers or cell phone towers. Those all are made with lead. And the people who work with those have generally the same type of lead levels that used to be in the general population, because the workers' lead levels, unlike the general population, has not gone down. Other sources of lead exposure involve people who are in construction industry, who might be knocking down or demolishing old lead paint or buildings made with old lead paint, people who are involved in certain aspects of making metal alloys. Lead is sometimes still added to certain things in the making of certain types of steel. Some people also have exposure to lead from non-occupational sources. You know, there are people who are still sometimes using old brass bowls or ceramic bowls or pewter bowls or cookware that can contain lead. And they should be very careful when they use these older materials today for purposes of serving food. Certain folk medicines still contain lead. For example, some medicines that are imported from Mexico or from India or other Asian countries that are non-traditional in the United States but might be traditional folk remedies in these other countries can sometimes be contaminated with lead.
So there are things we can do to limit our exposure. For people who have established heart disease, kind of two questions. Should we be checking lead levels in people with heart disease? And if we find an elevated lead level, is there anything we can do about it?
The American Heart Association has actually, in the past 2 years, written a position statement that identifies the fact and recognizes that lead is a risk factor that should be investigated. Whether or not it's cost effective to measure blood lead in everyone who sees a cardiologist still has to be sorted out. But I think it's important for all medical encounters on both a primary care basis or on a secondary basis in terms of seeing a cardiologist to be asked about their type of job and the type of habits that they have. And they should be asked, do you work with lead? Or have you worked with lead in the past? And give them some examples of some of these jobs, like making batteries or being involved in demolition or working in a foundry or working with brass. Even being frequently at an indoor firing range where lead is used in ammunition or used in the charge that propels the bullet out of the barrel when it's struck by the ignition part in the weapon, releases lead dust into the air. And that's another source. So I think we should certainly be aware of it and ask people about it. Another key thing that we really need to do, Ira, is we need to change the standards that currently exist to control lead exposure in the workplace. Because these standards were enacted back in the 1970s. Actually, those standards back there say that if someone has a lead level greater than 50 micrograms per deciliter or 60 micrograms per deciliter in their blood, that's too high and they need to be removed from exposure. But they didn't recognize when they set those standards back in the late 1970s that lead levels in the teens, blood lead levels in the teens, would be an increased risk factor. Many people today working with lead who are covered by OSHA standards are not being sufficiently protected. Those standards are out of date.
So that's a public health challenge. I want to just wrap up with this sort of individual challenge here. So for somebody who's had lead exposure in the past, maybe has heart disease now, is there anything other than limiting their exposure going forward that medicine has to offer these folks to lower their risk associated with that past exposure?
Not specifically, no, unfortunately.
Okay.
There are these drugs that have been looked at to reduce the amount of lead in the blood, but they don't undo the damage that's accumulated over time, because it's not just short-term lead exposure that results in this increased risk. It's years to decades. And the damage that has been done then can't be directly undone by any drugs. So we don't encourage people to get a specific treatment for low-level lead exposure today.
Okay.
What we do encourage them to do is to engage in other types of behavior that would otherwise increase their risk.
Right. Fix the things you can fix rather than the past exposure to lead. So make sure their cholesterol's okay, their blood pressure, those sorts of things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Michael, last question. If folks are interested in learning more about this issue, can you point them to some high-quality sources of information?
There have been some studies that have been published. There's a good review of the effects of lead and other heavy metals on heart disease that is available on the web pages of the American Heart Association, and I'd recommend that they look at that. There is information on occupational lead exposure in a position statement written by the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And their position statement on lead in the workplace is a good source for people who have that level of exposure.
Okay.
And the CDC has a web page on lead exposure from environmental sources, and particularly focuses on reducing childhood lead exposure.
Thank you so much for educating us about the connection between lead and heart disease.
It's been my pleasure, Ira. Thank you.
My guest has been Dr. Michael Kosnett. He is a clinical associate professor of pulmonary science and critical care medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and a consultant in medical toxicology and occupational and environmental medicine. Thanks also to our editor, Edward Lee, to our producer, Connor Pilkington, and our audio engineer, John Mullen. For more information about this particular program and to find all of our past episodes, please visit our website at medicine.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also subscribe to our free podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Our listeners are also welcome to send their comments, suggestions, and questions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's Well Said.